much, Tom, and thanks very much to the leadership of Yale for convening us with the Global Financial Integrity, and my fellow ambassadors and panelists, but most importantly, to all of you for staying the course. I'm really sorry that I have neither a slideshow nor an iPad from which to speak, and so you may have to do with just me talking about some of the things that concern both South Africa and the African continent in terms of the challenges that I think we're facing. On the one hand, reaching the goals of the Millennium Development Goals that were established, and on the other hand, dealing with the massive outflows of capital in illicit forms, particularly from the African continent. I want to say that next year in April, it will be 2 decades, 20 years since the demise of apartheid, and 20 years since Nelson Mandela became president of a free and democratic South Africa. It would also be 20 years in which we had established probably one of the most forward-looking constitutions that the world had seen, learning from the best practice of established constitutions, but often attempting to exceed the best practices by anticipating what would be the challenges of the modern era that we're living in. And so, for example, where the United States Constitution, which was a great inspiration to us in terms of personal and political rights, is very strong on freedoms, I think that we understood from our experience that we need also to enshrine not only our socio-political rights, but also the socio-economic rights that every South African should be entitled to. And the moment we inscribe that into our Constitution, we emerge with a whole set of obligations that would initially fall squarely in the hands of the state to deliver. And so, for example, we have the Constitution, we've got the commitment of government to meet the obligations of this Constitution, both in political terms and in social terms, but also in economic terms. It creates for us a basis in which the state would have to remain active as almost a safety net for society while we make this complicated transition from a race-based apartheid system which excluded the overwhelming majority of South Africans towards a far more non-racial and more equal system. And when we last looked, the Gini coefficient, that measure between the highest income earners and the lowest income earners, when purely measured by what the private sector delivers, what we call the economic wage, what people earn in the economy, that Gini coefficient was 0.7. The closer you get to 1, the more unequal your society. The closer you get to 0, the more equal your society. And we had a 0.7 economic Gini coefficient. When you add in the efforts of the state, the way in which the state had moved to provide people with water, electricity, sanitation, with old age pensions, child support grants, free healthcare, free education, the Gini coefficient, as measured then by the social wage, included into the economic wage, drops to 0.6, even at some points to below, to 0.58. And so what it establishes is that the role of the state in ensuring the reaching of our socio-economic goals for South Africans, and particularly as a subset of that, the Millennium Development Goals, I think is going to be fairly crucial. What it means, therefore, is that the state also has an obligation to patrol itself in terms of wastage, in terms of illicit flows, in terms of corruption, in terms of inefficiencies that it has. And so, for example, what we've simply done in South Africa through what Tom had spoken about, financial intelligence centers and so forth, is to understand how we create a banking system, a set of regulations in banking that I think minimizes the possibilities of corruption, sometimes in the private sector, sometimes in the public sector. And so it's no wonder that the South African banking system is Africa's largest banking system, and that it is regarded as the second best banking system in the world today. It didn't go through the trauma of the banking system, for example, in the United States around 2008. I think it's probably also that it's only in South Africa where you could have at that point a sitting deputy president charged for corruption, going to court and facing his day in court, who is currently the president. It's probably in South Africa that you can have ministers from sitting in parliament and in government sitting in jail for some of those kinds of things. And that's really part of the way in which we have moved to deal with the soft underbelly of a society in transition, where people don't often see the end goal of a more equal society, or they think it's far too far away. And therefore, shortcutism and short-termism becomes the order of the way in which people approach resources that they are in control of and that they have access to. And so I think that those become absolutely critical as we go forward. So the point that I'm making is that reaching the Millennium Development Goals as part of our overall socioeconomic goals is constitutionally inscribed in South Africa and have therefore also been turned into policy and regulatory positions within our Vision 2014. That the state is a driver of a lot of the public goods that are given to people, and not simply saying that the state sits back and lets water utilities, electricity utilities, and so forth take care of society, because without the state, society would implode. And it's particularly dangerous in South Africa because the economic divide is not simply an economic divide, it's also a racial divide. If you're white, you're likely to be in the top echelons of the Gini coefficient. If you're black, you're likely to be at the bottom echelons of that Gini coefficient. And so it is not only an economic obligation we have, it's also part of our drive for racial equity within a South African society post-apartheid. And so we live with contradictions in South Africa. It's got this sophisticated, largest economy in Africa, but it's got this massive poor. And as a former president described it, we've got a first economy and a second economy. I think increasingly we're discovering that we also have a third economy. The first economy is the sophisticated economy in which economic participation through the stock markets, through jobs, through investments and trade are the order of the day. And it's thriving and globally integrated. The second economy is the mass of poor black people who live largely of what the state is able to provide. And increasingly a third economy is a criminal economy. An economy that is based on drug trades. An economy that is based on illicit flows of capital. An economy that is based on poaching rhinos, poaching perlemoen, abalone, and a range of other things, and exchanging that for other illicit goods. An economy that is based on not respecting intellectual property and a range of other things. And so I think we're coming to terms with how we need to deal, how to certainly integrate the first two economies and eliminate the third economy. And those, I think, are the challenges that we face from a South African. And I use those particular examples simply to get away from the very highfalutin words we use sometimes to describe what the problem is and to diagnose that problem, because the harder you make it to understand the diagnosis, the harder you make to find the kind of remedies for such diagnoses as we go forward. And so we live with those contradictions within South Africa. And we understand that while we have, in some cases, the best healthcare system, regarded as some of the best universities in the world, we live with massive inequality within that education system, within that health system that we need to be able to manage. South Africa's freedom in 1994 came as a result of the collapse of the Cold War. Western powers overreach into Africa, ostensibly to fight communism, now ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so for the first time, Africa was allowed to be able to reach, to dream of a different future. And history will record that in the same 20-year period that South Africa was free, Africa had reached probably its greatest potential. Today, everyone knows that Africa is the second fastest growing region economically in the world. That 6 of the fastest growing national economies in the world are in Africa. That Africa holds the promise of food security for the world because it contains 60% of the available arable land in the world. Today, everyone knows that the highest rate of return on investment ever in the world, or anywhere today in the world, is in Africa, it's 8%. The global average is 3%. The United States average is 1.5% return on investments. Africa has a burgeoning middle class that is urbanizing at a rapid rate. It's reaching figures of 300 million, making groups like Walmart feel that they need to be there where the middle class is emerging very strongly, and it's virgin territory for retailers and consumer providers like them. And so that's the good news story that I think happens in Africa, coinciding with South Africa's freedom. More important than that, that success that Africa is registering economically is based on probably what is Nelson Mandela's greatest sacrifice in the world. Everyone thinks that his greatest sacrifice was being in jail for 27 years. I think his greatest sacrifice is that if anyone could be a president for life, or not even campaign to become the president in a second term, it would be Nelson Mandela. Instead, he chose to retire after 1 term. And when we tried to appeal to him to stay on, he said, if I go to the maximum, what example do I set to other African leaders who will feel that they need to go to the maximum? Let me show them that I'm prepared to retire, even before my time is up. And that has brought in a wave of reform, political reform across the African continent, regular elections across the African continent, presidents retiring, militaries retreating to the barracks, closely fought elections, most of them where the loser gracefully exits, 2 of them, 3 of them, where the loser does not exit as gracefully, but that's the exception more than it is the rule. And so the point that I'm making is that the process of democratization, of institution building, of deepening human rights in Africa, and increasingly creating the desire by governments to transfer revenues to the poor, that is increasingly happening across the African continent. The question is, why is the United Nations giving a 50% scorecard, positive scorecard, on the 8 Millennium Development Goals in Africa? The United Nations says on goal number 1, to eliminate extreme poverty and hunger, that we are not on track in Africa despite our growth rates. It's saying that with universal primary education, we are on track to reach that by 2015. It is saying that with gender equality and women's empowerment, we're on track. With child mortality, especially children dying under the age of 5 years old, we are not on track. In fact, there's an increasing trend that we are off track. Within that one, the improving of maternal health, we are not on track. More women are dying at childbirth than should die, and so we are not on track with regard to that. In the combating of HIV, malaria, and other diseases, we are on track. The fight against HIV is a hard fight, but it's beginning to show results, and we are confident of plateauing very soon. And environmental sustainability, South Africa shows that in increasing electricity to 70% of the people who were excluded under apartheid, we burn more coal. In getting the economies to positive growth, we're burning more coal. And so there's an environmental price, and so we are not on track on MDG number 7, and certainly on building global partnership for development, we are on track MDG number 8. So we have a 50-50 split on reaching the Millennium Development Goals. What are the trends from understanding that those Millennium Development Goals and why we are reaching some and not reaching others? Why is it that we are the second fastest growing region but not able to eliminate hunger and income insecurity and create food security for our people? despite the growth rates in Africa, it is not sufficient to decrease poverty and to halve poverty by 2015. And in that, we are looking at the impacts, firstly, of food insecurity. So the arable land is there, but it hasn't yet been cultivated. And those are long-term processes that we should do, and when we do it, we should be careful not to deforest, especially our rainforests, as we go forward. So it's a careful decision that I think we need to be making. The second impact is climate shocks and extreme weather. We've got an entire lake that has dried up, Lake Chad. We've got increasing desertification from the north and from the south, especially from the province I come from, the Western Cape. We have persistent structural inequalities. Sometimes, in South Africa's case, it is race-based. And we have reached our quantitative goals in health and education, but not necessarily our qualitative goals. We need a second transition. Having reached our quantitative transformation, we now need to focus on a qualitative transformation about what goes on in the schools, in the health facilities, in the economy. So we need to drive that very carefully. So those are the nice impacts, in a sense, that we deal with the obvious ones. But I think that what this conference shines a light on is the less obvious, less spoken about impact. And that's the impact of illicit capital outflows from the African continent. And here we are very thankful, Tom, to the global financial integrity research, studies, and surveys that you've done to actually shine a qualitative light on this matter. Because we all have feelings about what's happening. We all have outrages about where's the money going. We all lash out, oh, the president is sitting with 8% growth, but why is he eating up the money? I think that what you have done is to be able to quantify our concerns, to define them better, and to focus them in a way that I think Africa has found very, very useful. And so, using your estimates, the estimates of illicit flows from Africa is double the inflows of overseas development aid. For every $1 that flows into Africa, $2 seem to flow out. We are fighting in shifting sands and with our backs to the wall, if I can mix metaphors. The impact of those outflows are enormous because they create volatility and they create unpredictability in currencies, inflation, in tax revenue, and all of those kind of things. You can't predict what you will get in because you often don't have a handle on how it is going out, where it is going to, and how much is going out. The impact of that on investor confidence, trade confidence, is also fairly enormous. And it is probably one of the main contributors to an increase in poverty and a widening in the income gaps that I think I've described earlier to you. What the study shows is that this isn't a new phenomenon. This isn't a decolonization phenomenon only, and it's not certainly a post-Cold War phenomenon. This is something that I think have happened during colonialism with massive outflows. Some of the African elites, post-colonialism, had imitated what they had seen before them by conspicuous consumption, buying properties overseas, buying jewelry overseas, getting money out in conspicuous consumption ways. But the bulk of the outflows have been what multinational corporations have been doing through their so-called tax planning, their tax evasion campaigns, their sophisticated accounting, and all of those kind of things. So it's good to think that the corrupt persons are the Africans. They do contribute to it. But our Western partners are leading the charge in these illicit outflows. And so, going to the Global Financial Integrity Study, they have estimated that $854 billion in illicit financial flows left Africa between 1970 and 2008. They've estimated that the total illicit outflows have been in the order of $1.8 trillion US. flowing out, increasing at about 12% per annum. That's the scale of the problem that we're facing. They've begun to regionalize it in Africa, saying that the main areas where it's happening is in Central Africa, and that great treasure trove, the Congo, sits there, and West Africa and another treasure trove, Nigeria, and others sit there. South Africa is the 5th greatest source of capital outflows. I think we've been at the level of about 25 billion in outflows. So if it can happen even in a fairly sophisticated banking market, fairly sophisticated economy like South Africa, it's more possible where other institutions are in formation. And so that's the challenge that we are facing. It's also not entirely coincidental that the acceleration in outflows and the highest amount of outflows coincided almost entirely with Africa's growth spurt from 2000 to 2008. So there was a very direct linkage between the increased prosperity that McKinsey and everyone, JP Morgan, everyone is hailing. There's been a very direct relationship between the increasing prosperity and the amount of outflows. In fact, from before that, we had outflows in the order per annum of about 17 billion. It's now reaching an average of 50 billion. Thanks very much for all the work that you've done, because you've seen I've begun to understand some of those issues, and it's horrific. And therefore, that begins to make us understand why you did not have a massive assault on poverty, on inequality, a massive attempt to reach the goals that were set by the United Nations for 2015 over the same corresponding period that we are talking about. And it's possible in Africa because I think one is dealing with a continent in transition. There's still massive areas of political instability where institutions haven't been built, where systems are weak, accounting is weak, the macroeconomic stability is still not in place, and sometimes African states have often tried to compensate for one or other reason by having capricious tax laws on investors, therefore saying to investors, it's probably better if you siphon your money off and pay your tax elsewhere. And so I think it's really a sharing of responsibility in all of those kind of things. When some of these stories reach Western newspapers, the picture is painted, it's personalized and individualized. A corrupt president there, a public servant there. The truth of the matter is that responsible for those outflows from Africa, 3% by and large would be the responsibility of public officials, 3%. 30 to 35% can be laid at the door of organized crime. 60 to 65% happens through international trade. Those respectable companies who issue you their annual reports, who fight each other and give each other awards and pay each other bonuses. 65% of that 856 billion that has flowed out of Africa can be laid at the door of decent business people who get rewarded on the other side of the Atlantic for good business practices. And they do this through falsified pricing, through money laundering, through the creation and the usage of tax havens and understated commercial transactions. Africa had begun to ask the question, why are we not able, with our prosperity, to make a dent into the really hard economic aspects of our Millennium Development Goals? And the former South African President Thabo Mbeki leads the high-level panel in Africa, which you are on. And thanks very much, because I think that there is a sharpness to it that's beginning to ask the right questions, get the right statistics and data available to us, and begin to point in the right direction, Dr. Foggy. So I think what we are beginning to do is to understand the nature and the patterns of illicit financial outflows, because you've got to understand the animal to deal with the animal. The level of the outflow so that we don't do guesswork and we get it to the nearest decimal figure. The implications of it for development, and mobilizing, most importantly, the political will to deal with it. How do we create regional and international organizations? And this asks a very fundamental question of the United Nations. Because part of our inability to deal with this matter is the fact that our entire transnational system is based on international governance and not necessarily global governance. International governance is where you coordinate between nations. Global governance is often where you need to transcend nations in order to deal with persistent, deep problems, whether it is solving a disease or whether it is managing the outflows of capital. And so we all need, maybe even to cede some sovereignty in order to achieve a bigger goal, such as stopping the illicit flows. It's when we all stand on our own sovereignty that we revert to an outdated system of international coordination rather than global leadership on a particular matter. And we must understand, and this is what that high-level group also must do, is to understand the articulation between suboptimal domestic policies and regulations and flaws in the global financial system. It's not an either-or. We have to correct both sides of the coin if we are going to move forward. I want to end by really just focusing on what the impact is on development. What do we lose in terms of development when we allow these outflows to continue? Donor-driven efforts and state interventions, never mind how generous, like in the case of South Africa, will result in continued underachievement on all the development goals that we set. You can't lose 50 billion per annum of an African budget and still reach optimum developmental results. If we lost 854 billion in outflows and we lose at an average of 50 billion per annum, can you imagine if we didn't lose it? And the United Nations says that if we want to reach our goals, our MDGs, by 2015, we need to put in $529 billion US into it. That could solve a problem. You begin to see the scale of the perniciousness of this outflow. These illicit outflows contribute to this mismatch where a continent is growing at an average of 5.9%. That's the GDP growth in Africa on average. Yet the per capita growth is only 2.7%. That's the mismatch. That is the daylight robbery. And I'm using very colloquial terms, Doctor, if you don't mind. But that's the daylight robbery. So I think that the UN high-level panel is correct in its 5 thematic areas. Leave no one behind. Sustainable development must be at the core. The 4th one, peace and effective, open, accountable institutions, is critical to it. The 5th one, a new global partnership. And the 3rd one, the transformation of the economy fundamentally to achieve those kind of goals. I think that unless we are going to use the consensus at a conference like this to really not only to create the tools, the insight, the intelligence, the will and the wherewithal to fight illicit flows, but also to create a global outrage that we are making people poor, we are widening the inequality between people, that we are condemning women to die at childbirth, that we are condemning children to die before they reach the age of 5, unless we, ordinary citizens like us, complement the technical and financial language of the experts, we are not going to be able to deal with the scourge. I hope I've not been too long, and thanks very much for the opportunity.